The difference between a track, a beat, a vibe, a riff, and a complete work is like night and day. And so what I'm trying to talk to you about today is your track or work ready for a mix or for mastering? I hear a lot of guys, I read a lot of things in the comments. I have artists sending me work to be mixed and mastered, and they're wondering why it doesn't come out the way they think it's going to come out. And that's, generally speaking, it's because these works are not ready. They're not ready to be mixed. And the way I can tell you is that from working on thousands of tracks, that everything that was eventually mixed and mastered that went on to do anything already sounded like a work, a complete work, before the mix even started. It's probably somewhat controversial. I'm not trying to like come down on anybody that makes beats or does production, but it's like, this is a big discussion that I don't think that a lot of mixers give up the info on. This is a complicated topic because some of you out there are beat makers. Some of you are out there are artists who are making their own tracks, recording their own tracks, mixing them, and probably mastering them, or using some sort of online mastering software to master your tracks. And how do you know, until you know, whether your track is actually ready to be mixed? And there's probably, like, I have notes here, there's like probably a million indicators. I mean, the best way for you to know is by doing and failing and doing and failing and doing and succeeding, and then eventually you'll have the feel for when a track is ready. Any track I ever worked on that was successful, and it's not just in a sales context, anything that was successful that were like, you know, the record when it was done, everyone loved the way the record came out. The mix was the final sheen to the whole thing. It was where it was all sort of like polished up, glued together, finessed. But if you were to take away the mix, these were still complete thoughts. They were complete works. They had, and I'll give you they had interesting instrumentation. And any combination of these things, they could have, most of the things were non-negotiable, that they had to be there. The foundation of the track had to be there. So drums, bass, chord progression, melodic content, counter melody, counter hook, and you know, counter melody and counter rhythms are in hip hop also. So that's your flow. Like, not every verse is going to be exactly the same. That's counter rhythm to the rhythms that you have going on the beat. I find that a lot of stuff that gets sent to me that doesn't translate to bigger things tends to be short on hooks. If you listen to records that you love going back to whenever, 70s, 80s, 90s, now, the ones that stick around are the tracks that have very memorable, very recognizable to the ear hooks. And those hooks can be lyrical, they can be melodic, rhythmic, combination of all three, bringing together something that actually is a complete thought and a bit of a journey, you know, a story within the 3 minutes that you have to get that across. And if you really think about it, most songs only have somewhere around 1:20 to really get a story across, and then a certain amount of things repeat. So, you know, you come back through the second chorus, the second verse, second chorus, maybe even a third verse and a third chorus, or a bridge, and then an ending. If you are putting together just tracks, those aren't songs. Those aren't complete thoughts yet. So the foundation has to be tight enough and strong enough to inspire someone to write to it, or if you're going to be the person writing to it, taking it and making it an evolved piece of work as opposed to a vibe or a real quick thought. If you're wondering, if you're jamming out 15 beats a day, that's exactly what you're doing. You're cranking out beats. You're not cranking out complete works. If you're cranking out 15 complete works a day, you are supernatural. So what I'm trying to get across here is that I think the mixing / mastering phase is somehow thought of as the answer, or that's where the holy grail is. It's in the mix. And I'm a mix engineer, and I'm telling you that yes, a great mix can really help a great work, but a great mix will not turn something that is just a vibe into an amazing piece of work that people will connect with and hold on to for a long time. Too much emphasis on the mix bus, the EQ, that gets into the mastering thing. So what happens is you can take I will say this, you can take a bad mix or a relatively bad mix and crush it with all kinds of mastering and make it sound a little bit better. You can make it sort of sound like it might be something. It won't be something, but you could kind of fool yourself. But you can't fool the masses. As much as people would like to say that the masses are easily fooled, I don't think they are. I think they actually will give you a very good indication of whether something you're doing is connecting with them or not. I am also going to talk about some comments. I like to relate to the comments because I do read them. I'll probably come back to is it just a beat or is it a complete work in another episode. I have done things in some other episodes where I talk about the emphasis on the mix and where that is. I think what you really need to try and suss out is if you're a mixer, you got to be honest with your client and say like, hey, I don't think this thing is ready to be mixed, if you don't feel it's ready to be mixed. And if you're a producer, before you go to that step of bringing your track to a mixer, the complete vibe should be there, the complete thought, the arrangement of, in other words, you should be jumping around the room with your artist because the track is doing something, and then you should be excited in that when it is mixed, it'll just be taking that 8 to a 10. There's no such thing as taking a 2 to a 9. If I could use that, ranking thing, 10 being the best or 10 being hot. So I'll give you a couple of quick comments. One guy asked, how hard should I be hitting tape plugins, the Studer or the Ampex? You should be hitting them as hard as you like the sound of it. I mean, if I was sending a snare or a guitar to a Studer or Ampex tape emulation plugin, there's no rules. There is the pretty simple concept of turn it up until you like the sound of it. If you go too far, turn it back down, back off a little bit. I think those are fun things to play with, the tape emulations, tape plugins. I just tried the Studer plugin on a mix, and I liked the sound of it. It did a little something. That's not an endorsement, it's just whatever. How to make songs translate well on smartphones. Any techniques or plugins related to that? It is my biggest struggle these days. If your mix sounds great on your speakers or in your regular headphones, and it makes sense in relation to all the other commercial released music that you're listening to on those. And I would hope that on your studio monitoring situation that you would listen to music that you like the sound of. Like if you're trying to fit in with current hip hop or current pop, bedroom pop even, you should be listening to a bunch of that in your studio environment, so that when you start working on your mixes, you can understand if they're relating to what you were listening to. It shouldn't be shocking when you go from listening to commercial music to your mixes. And if it is, it's not going to translate anywhere. So it won't translate on your earbuds or your headphones or your car stereo or your Bluetooth jobby. Get comfortable with your monitors, whatever they are. I don't care if you mix on Sony headphones. As long as you can get your stuff to sound right on those in relation to the other music that you think sounds right, then you'll be in the right ballpark. If you're having a hard time mixing on or getting your stuff to sound good on a smartphone, you could test print and listen on your phone to see if you're in the ballpark, and then A/B it to other things that you like the sound of on your phone. It's kind of a deep answer to that whole thing. Talk about why you stay mixing inside the box. At home, I don't have listen, if I had an SSL here, would I use it as a summing mixer? Yes. If an artist I'm working with is interested in that environment, being in a big studio with an SSL or a Neve sitting there, will I use it? Absolutely. I kind of enjoy it, but I've been mixing in the box since somewhere around 2003, and at the very least mixing in the box with using a console as a summing mixer during that transition. So if you take something like I did So Simple, Alicia Keys, I mixed that in the box with a little bit of summing mixing on an SSL in England somewhere. And the label guy on that session wanted me to make that sound, of all things, like a 90s hip-hop record. And I do remember that I used a rented Empirical Labs Fatso on the mix bus. And this was the days also of, I would do pre-mastering, but with no limiting. And those records would get sent off to Herb Powers, who would put the final mastering on those records. One of the reasons why you would want to use a real mastering engineer to do your mastering, particularly on a record that that has the budget. If you're not the only producer and or you're not the only engineer, so say you're putting a record together for an artist and there's tracks with multiple producers and multiple engineers. A mastering engineer, part of his gig is to kind of blend those together a little bit, like bring them together so that they all sound like they're on the same album, if you're going for the album vibe. Some other guy gave me a whole list of tracks. He gave me a hard time about me talking about bedroom pop, and then I realized that I think he's trying to promote all these other artists by having a list of all this stuff that he thinks is amazing. And the reason I know that he's kind of lost is that, like, even the first record that I listened to, and I read the comments, and then I go and check out what you guys are talking about. Yeah, nice try. The tracks you recommended were all generally garbage, and they sound like vibes to me. They don't sound like real records, which is, Spotify is loaded with that. Another guy says, I'm still hoping to hear stories about the engineers who were the old guard around the time of the Tribe era and how they dealt with new producers. Okay, so that's part of me talking about what it was like particularly, it was in the early 90s when you had this transition happening, in that most engineers in the very early 90s were, and in the 80s, I mean, rock was the big thing. Rock and pop was the big thing in the 80s in major recording studios. So big budget recording studios. And as hip hop started rising to the level of having the budgets to enter into the big budget recording studios, there was a meeting of the, worlds were colliding, as I said before, in that hip hop is coming in. You had a bunch of rock engineers, pop engineers, and then the question was put to those guys, like, hey, we have this hip hop session. We're looking for an engineer. And I mean, truth of the matter is, a lot of those guys ran for the hills. They did not take those bookings. And some of them maybe took one and then said, like, okay, that's not for me, for whatever reason. Maybe they didn't like the volume. Maybe they didn't like anything. I mean, it's not like there weren't drugs on the 80s sessions. So it's not like they could say like, oh, there was too much weed on that session, whatever. But anyway, for whatever reason, a lot of the rock and pop engineers didn't want to do the hip hop stuff. Some of it could be because like a lot of rock and pop engineers were in the game because they had a love for recording multiple instruments, bands, drums, guitars, pianos, whatever. So working with hip hop, which meant more or less dropping a beat from an SP1200 or an MPC and doing some overdubs, maybe with a couple of keyboards, if that, recording turntable work, and then vocals without singing was not appealing to a lot of those type of engineers. So what happened was new guys, such as myself and several of my other friends, who were kind of the same generation or whatever, for some of us didn't have any choice. It was like that was the work that we could get, and you took it. And some guys loved it. Myself, I loved it. Some guys really were into it. Some guys decided like, ooh, this isn't for me. And some of them just left the business or went into other things, doing jingles or whatever. Or some of them went into mastering. They're like, I can't handle those hours. And I can't handle the hip hop lifestyle or whatever. I'm just going to go do mastering. And that's a 9 to 6 job, 9 a.m. to 6 p.m. And that's it. Mastering guys were out the door. In hindsight, it was a pretty damn cush gig. But so the worlds were colliding. And it was interesting because as a guy who was doing 90s hip hop and R&B, and that R&B was included, Jodeci, Mary J., all these people. We couldn't even get the first choice assistant engineers because those guys only wanted to do the high-end rock pop stuff, the Mariah Carey, the Paul Simon, whoever, Steve Perry, all these legacy acts, a lot of that kind of thing. So it was, we were an up and coming bunch from kind of like new engineers, artists who were not used to being in big recording studios, assistant engineers who weren't exactly the most experienced. So everybody was sort of dealing with this learning together kind of thing. And I think that had a lot to do with some of the sound that we wound up with, is that there was a lot of rule breaking because some of us didn't even know the rules, or we were kind of making up the rules as we went along. We didn't have the super knowledgeable assistants who would say like, oh, this is how that's done or whatever. There was definitely a growing together kind of thing that went on. And that's part of how I could describe all that. Did I cover all the comments that I wanted to cover? Yep.